We'll let them join. And welcome, everybody. My name is Lisa Sawsville. I'm with Vermont Coverts Woodlands for Wildlife. We're happy to host Brendan Popp with the Wildlife Services to talk to us about feral pigs in Vermont. And that's a big question mark. What do we know? What do we need to know? And if you don't know, Vermont Coverts is a nonprofit statewide that works with landowners about managing their woodlands for wildlife. And we have a 3-day cooperator training, and we offer stewardship workshops. Usually these kinds of things are in person. We've moved all of our programming online. If you'd like to see what kind of programming is going on through our organization and many of our partners, you can sign up for our e-news on our website, and you can learn about all these and other programs that are going on by Coverts and other organizations around the state. And at this point, I'm just going to let Brendan tell us a little bit about himself and the organization he works for and feral pigs in Vermont. So take it away, Brendan.
Thanks, Lisa. Hi, everyone. I'm Brendan Popp. I'm a biological science technician with the U.S. Department of Agriculture's Animal and Plant Health Inspection Services, and then Wildlife Services under that. Wildlife Services deals primarily with nuisance wildlife around the country. Our mission is to protect the agricultural resources of the United States, specifically from wildlife. In Vermont, we deal with a whole bunch of different stuff, from protecting endangered turtles on Lake Champlain, to doing cormorant control work, to doing obviously the feral pigs, to doing all of the rabies management in the state. So tonight we're going to talk about feral pigs in Vermont, and yes, there are feral pigs in Vermont, so we can answer that question right off the bat. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen with a presentation here.
Brendan, while you're getting your screen up, I'm going to remind everybody, if you would mute yourself, that limits background noise from interfering with other listeners. Also, I'll be monitoring the chat box, so if you have any questions, go ahead and type those in the chat box, and Brendan will take those questions at the end, and I'll help facilitate working through those.
All right, is that sharing the presentation mode, or?
Not yet, give it a second. Right now, it's still showing your next slide, so it's not quite gotten into presentation mode yet.
Hold on one sec.
You got it now.
There we go. That good?
That still shows the notes. I mean, the next slide. That's good.
Okay, great. All right, so tonight, obviously, we're going to be talking about feral swine in Vermont, the increasing threat of feral swine in Vermont. This picture here was taken in Vermont. It is an individual that we've removed down in Randolph. So that is a Vermont feral swine. So to begin with, I'm going to talk a little bit about just feral swine in general. People often refer to them as wild pigs, wild hogs, wild boars, razorback, or piney woods rooter. I'm going to refer to them as feral swine because that's the terminology that we use. Feral swine are not native in the United States. There are currently estimates of upwards of 6.5 million that are in the United States, and they are known to exist in at least 38 states and 3 territories, and this has been a significant expansion in range in the past 30 years. So they used to be much more contained, and they've just had an explosive expansion. They're extremely adaptable and really just have a huge tolerance for different types of climates. So they're found from Florida to Michigan, which, you know, very, very different climates there. And the reason that they can do this is they're really opportunistic generalists. So they will eat anything from dead animals to grain to acorns to invertebrates to fawns to basically just anything that they can find. So feral swine look very different from each other. So they often look a lot like domestic pigs, or like, you know, pigs that you would see in someone's farm, because there's a lot of interbreeding between escaped domestic stock and introduced wild boars from Europe, and then a lot of pigs that escape and aren't recaptured from domestic farms eventually become feral and then turn into wild pigs, and those genetics get passed down. So they come in a lot of different shapes and sizes and colors. The Eurasian pigs and hybrids usually have longer legs, snout, and the guard hair, which runs down the neck to the tail, which is usually grizzled brown to black, but obviously can have some exceptions. The adults average about 100 to 200 pounds, but some very large animals can be up to 400 or 500 pounds, and those are the ones that generally have domestic ancestry in them. And one of the reasons that they're so good at dispersing is their age at first breeding is usually 6 months. So they can breed really early in life. And if they have really good habitat and nutrition, they can have multiple litters per year. And they can have between 3 to 8 piglets in each litter, but can have as high as 13. So they have the highest fecundity of any ungulate in North America. And so the population can triple in 1 year, which is just absolutely astounding for a species that we don't really want here. The social structure usually are in family groups of 1 to 2 sows with their piglets, and then the adult boars are generally solitary and dispersing across the landscape. So feral swine were originally introduced in the 1500s by Spanish settlers so that they would have a source of food when they first came to North America. And it was common back then to free-range domestic pigs. And then later on, as Europeans spread across the continent, the Eurasian boar was introduced for hunting in the late 1800s and early 1900s, and were established as a population as a hunting species. And despite them being introduced then, they had relatively small populations and didn't really explode as a population until the 1980s. So before that, they were generally confined to Hawaii, the southeastern United States, Texas, and California. Some of the range expansion that we've seen has been natural, but a lot of it is suspected due to illegal introductions for hunting across state lines or even within states to places that people just want them for hunting. There also are populations that get started with swine getting loose from, rural backyards or people's free-ranging domestic pigs, which still happens. Sometimes they do escape from these high-fenced hunting operations, so game farms will often have wild boars, and sometimes they will escape due to there's just so many miles of fence to patrol, and they get weakened and damaged by storms, or even in some cases by poachers. There's a feral swine expert who once said, when a fence is designed to hold water, it will be good enough to contain pigs. So you can kind of see the amount of, or what we're trying to deal with when trying to contain feral swines. It's just really hard to contain them. Another reason for their expansion is they just have high survival rate. There's just a lack of predators that will go after them because they're mean and nasty. And they can endure high rates of hunting harvest and outcompete most wildlife, going back to the being able to triple their population in a year. If you hunt a few of them, there's still going to be so many out there that can reproduce. And also, just again, you can't overemphasize the wide climate tolerance, being able to live from, the mountains of Hawaii to the Everglades in Florida to, existing in Vermont in the winter and surviving that. So, they just have such a range of climates that they can live in. So in this map, you can see this is the feral swine populations in 1982 by county. That was populations that were reported and confirmed to USDA. So as you can see, most of them are over in California, Texas, and then down, obviously, Florida, Georgia, Alabama, South Carolina, Louisiana, and obviously Hawaii. So as you can back in the 1980s, we had a problem, but it is not as large as the problem today, as you can see by this map, which was the populations and individuals that were confirmed in 2019. So, huge spread down in the southeast to most counties in those states down there. And then, spreading up into Oregon, over into Nevada. And then you can see populations springing up in New Hampshire, and then some counties in Vermont that also reported some stuff, as well as that population that sprung up in Michigan there, and that one little place in North Dakota, which will come into our conversation a little bit later. So Vermont feral swine. Yes, we do have populations, as you can see from that map that I just showed you. So we had first confirmed a feral swine in Lyndonville in 2018 in the fall, like October, November then. And we removed that in March of 2019. And that one we sent the genetics in, and it has a genetic match to a pig that was removed in 2017 in New Hampshire. So it was probably the same family group, and the theory is that they were maybe siblings. So that pig came from the New Hampshire populations. Last year in 2019, we had 2 confirmed individuals, one in Randolph, which we removed in July, and one in Thetford, which was removed in October. So all of these were lone boars, which generally have a higher dispersal rate than the sows. And there have been some studies of collared swine in Michigan that have shown that the boars just range for miles and miles and miles. So we're hopeful that these boars were individuals and didn't have a sounder, which is what a group of pigs is called, with them, and that we don't have piglets running around the state, which would make our job much, much harder. The one that we removed in Randolph, we also sent the genetics back, and it is also probably from that New Hampshire population, but we didn't have as high confidence as we did with the Lyndonville pig, and we haven't got genetics back from the Thetford one. The 4th point on that map there is a piglet that was found dead in someone's backyard that we sent the genetics in, and that came back as domestic stock. So we aren't worried about that one being a wild pig. So we've had 3 confirmed individuals within the last 2 years, all 3 of which have been removed. Currently, we are investigating reports from Linden, Sheffield, Charleston, Coventry, Arlington, and Bennington, where people have reported feral swine to us. Since I made this PowerPoint, some of those have been, we've confirmed that they were domestic stock that had just escaped and that the farmer had gotten them back. Some of them we are still investigating, which we'll talk about a little bit later. So as I was talking about a little bit in that slide, how did feral swine get into Vermont? So wild populations in the Northeast do appear to be relatively sparse, which is a good thing. The 2 main spots that we see threats of feral swine coming into Vermont from are Canada and New Hampshire. So in Canada, they have a bunch of pig facilities up there. So facilities that have kind of pigs that range around, might be fenced in, but the fences obviously can fail, pigs can get out, and they do have some free-ranging swine. So this is a map that we got sent by the Ontario Ministry of Natural Resources and Forestry from one of their biologists there, of all of the sightings of feral swine that they have been investigating. So as you can see, there are a decent amount of them, and they do kind of border the international border and could potentially come down into the state, which would not be ideal. The other place, obviously, is New Hampshire. This map shows feral swine that have been removed by the New Hampshire Office of Wildlife Services. So there is a wild population there that it has been theorized has come from a game farm that pigs have escaped from. So they have Eurasian boars there that people go in to hunt within the preserve, and obviously the fence is not as secure as we would hope it would be, and pigs have escaped from there and obviously come into Vermont from there. So those are the two places that we're really concentrating on in terms of feral swine individuals entering the state and establishing population here, which we don't think that we have an established population at the moment, and we are trying our very, very best to keep it that way. So feral swine management is a really large topic that, you know, somebody could teach a college class on. So I'm going to summarize it for everybody in 1 to 5 slides here. So who is responsible for feral swine management? It's really kind of hard to figure it out, and deciding whose responsibility it is can be challenging. Really, in most cases, no agency or organization really wants feral swine, and it also leads to a reluctancy to take the lead because it's very, very expensive and time consuming to be the agency managing feral swine. So in Vermont, it is Wildlife Services that is doing it alongside Vermont Fish and Wildlife and the State Agriculture Agency. We've all partnered up to try and keep Vermont feral swine free. Obviously, the Agency of Ag has concerns about feral swine carrying diseases into our domestic populations of pigs that are very vital for our farm economy here. It is illegal in Vermont to possess or transport feral swine. So there is that, which is nice. And we do have many necessary cooperators within the government and other people. So we do have the state wildlife and ag departments. We do partner with other federal agencies. Wildlife Services partners with another branch of APHIS, Veterinary Services, and then we also partner with an organization within Wildlife Services called the National Wildlife Research Center, which is where we send all of our genetics to get them sequenced so that we can figure out where these pigs came from. We do have the international cooperation. We have talked with people from Canada, from their department or Ministry of Natural Resources and Forestry, and then also some universities in Canada that are doing studies on the populations there and have given us information regarding reports in proximity to Vermont and New Hampshire on the Canadian side of the border. And then obviously we partner with the domestic swine industry, conservation organizations like VT Coverts, and then private landowners are a really huge one for us, and will be more of the focus of this talk, because hopefully we can entice all of you people listening to help us be on the lookout for feral swine in your backyards. When it comes to feral swine, USDA Wildlife Services removes thousands every year, mostly from down in the southeastern United States, Texas, California, Hawaii, those places that have just massive populations. Obviously, our 3 in Vermont contributed to that, but only minimally. So next I'm going to talk about, obviously, because we want all of you to be on the lookout for feral swine in Vermont, how you can recognize feral swine sign, which you're much more likely to see than the feral swine themselves. So one of the main things that they do is called wallow, which is basically they just get down in the mud and the dirt and roll around and create these big pits. And this is not only a good way to determine where they are, but also is, you know, just destructive to habitat and is not something that anyone wants on their lawn. So they can be found in wet areas during the summer months. They're usually near wet areas, so near ponds, creeks, and swamps. They're used to help cool down to avoid the summer heat, and they ward off biting insects by covering the individual in mud. Often the individual will just lie in them most of the daytime during hot weather, and they also do this in the snow as well. And this does lead to contamination of water sources due to fecal material, which can contribute to bacteria and pathogens, which no one wants in their water sources. So another thing they do is very similar to deer, which are tree rubs, although they do it a little bit more aggressively. They do this to remove the dried mud, hair, and parasites, especially after wallowing. So they'll roll around in the mud and then dry off and then try and rub all that mud off, and it gets all the, any ticks or other parasites that they might have, and it's kind of like a bear scratching. They do this on trees, fallen logs, fence posts, rocks, telephone poles, and usually, it's by the base, and a 3 to 4 foot high rub indicates that there are adult individuals in the area. Obviously, lower down ones would indicate juveniles. So feral pigs are omnivores, so their diet shifts between seasons, and therefore the droppings shift as well. They're often tubular and filled with mast, so acorns, beech nuts, vegetation, and they can honestly range from domestic dog to looking like horse droppings to looking like a bear dropping, especially, diets of young grass and shoots will result in, kind of patties that look like a bear or a cow or something like that. So there's just a huge variety, which makes identifying the droppings just really, really hard to do. They do also make these trails because they're kind of shorter and squatter than most of the wildlife that we have in Vermont. You can see kind of like the trail that goes through, especially in the snow. They'll definitely plow through the snow as opposed to stepping over it like a deer will. That picture in the middle there was taken in New Hampshire. So in the deep snow, you want to look for troughs because they'll push through rather than step over the snow. And they do tend to create pathways that they will use over and over and over again. So you can find pretty well-worn paths where there have been feral swine. All right, tracks. Tracks are hard. I personally struggle with them a lot when I go out to investigate a report of feral swine, and honestly, they just look so much like deer tracks, depending on the substrate, that it's just really hard to tell the difference. But I will endeavor to point out some differences that you can use. So in general, feral swine tracks tend to be more circular in shape than deer tracks do. Although again, depending on the substrate, depending on how they're stepping, it can be really hard to tell the difference. They do have blunted or rounded toes for the most part, as you can see there at the pig foot, and then that picture down in the sand. And the dew claws, which are the little protrusions that are sticking out at the back there, tend to fall wider than the hoof. So it tends to splay out more than you would find with a deer. So deer tracks are obviously more heart-shaped for the most part. Again, it really depends on the substrate and, can be really, really hard to tell. And the dew claws typically register within the shape of the track. But again, if you have a deer that's going downhill or stepping in particularly deep mud or snow, they can be more spread out to help provide stability. So, I struggle with it a whole lot. I know other people that I've gone out with struggle with it a whole lot. And in Vermont, we just don't have the opportunity to see a lot of pig tracks that we can compare to deer tracks. So, we do what we got to do. And then deer toes register closer together depending on the substrate. Again, you have a pig that's, going downhill, or a deer that's going downhill, and they can be super splayed out, and it can be really hard to tell the difference. One of the best ways to determine feral swine sign is the bed's nest and pigloos, which is a great term that I love. They create these shallow beds by overturning soil to expose dirt, and then lay dense vegetation, brush, vines, brambles, thickets, fallen trees on top. The beds are often associated with wallowing areas, and as many as 15 hogs may occupy a bed area. this middle picture here is a pigloo, which is kind of a nest den that the pigs create. I believe this one was somewhere out in the Midwest, and they found 2 individuals inhabiting that. So they do create these weird little igloo made out of grass things. And then they create in the winter these nests in the trees using tree branches and stuff like that. This picture is from the pig that we removed in Lyndonville. So this is a Vermont nest that we are seeing in the snow, based, in those evergreen trees. All right, damage. Damage is the way that we most hear about pigs because, they go tromping through someone's field and someone wants to report the damage so that we can remove the pig. There are a couple different types of damage that they do. It's mostly agricultural damage, property damage, ecological damage, and this costs an estimated $1.5 billion annually in damage and control efforts. So it's, it costs a lot of money for people to repair the damage that the pigs have done, and also for the government and individuals, landowners, farmers to pay for someone to come in and remove the pigs. So it's not an insignificant amount of money that is spent every year trying to control this population. They damage fields and lawns, and this picture here is a graveyard. They're roadkill, so they can be a hazard to people's health, and they could decrease water quality through the stirring of silt and bacterial contamination. So all around, just bad news to have pigs. So let's talk a little bit more about agricultural damage. So they will just go rooting through people's fields, destroying corn, and just absolutely tearing it up. It's been studied, and there was a paper that came out that says they can destroy as much as 1,000 acres per hour if you have a big sounder of them. So you can imagine that could, a group of pigs could go through an area and just absolutely wipe out someone's livelihood, or, a food source or something like that. So it's just really not good. Obviously property. It's another picture of a graveyard here. A monument that got rooted up, the grass around it, just, someone's backwoods there, or even golf courses. They also will destroy irrigation lines, and have been known to root up around airports, so making it dangerous for people to land, and along highways as well. So basically they will go wherever they find food and just try and root up as much as they can and just go to town and destroy stuff. So one of the biggest concerns is their damage to wildlife. This is a picture of a pig depredating a turtle nest, I believe down in South Carolina. So omnivores, they will eat anything, including, endangered wildlife, or if they can get them, a fawn that's just sitting on the ground and they come across it, they'll go ahead and eat that too. And obviously destroying habitat for wildlife as well. So one of the biggest concerns with them is endangered species. So as I mentioned before, sea turtles, so their keen sense of smell, along with the digging and rooting abilities, will lead them to turtle nests buried either in sand or in soil. So on Keewatin Island in Florida, in some years, the feral swine nest predation was so bad that they destroyed every single endangered green sea turtle nest on the island. And after the feral swine were removed, the nest success of the turtle improved dramatically. So, just a huge impact on endangered turtles there. The prairie chicken, which nests on the ground and leaves their eggs and young easily accessible, they are on the decline, and it can be partially attributed to predation by feral swine, not completely, but there is evidence to suggest that feral swine have contributed significantly to this decline of the prairie chicken. And also in the prairie chicken's habitat, when they root up plants, it's often replaced by invasive species that are not good for prairie chickens to nest in or feed on. There's a picture of a pig going into a nest that's on the ground there. The Houston toad is an endangered toad in Texas, which they prevent the toad from breeding successfully by disturbing the adults, eating the eggs, and contaminating the water. And then once fencing was put up around this particular population, the toads were able to successfully breed, and that's because the swine were excluded from damaging the breeding habitat. So another case of just endangered species that are getting hammered by the invasive swine. So this is the Mead's milkweed, which is an endangered species of milkweed, and the swine will degrade the tallgrass prairie that the milkweed depends on for its life cycle. They also prey on the milkweed by uprooting it and consuming the roots and the seed pods. The milkweed takes 15 years or longer to reach maturity and to be able to reproduce, making it really sensitive to being disturbed by feral swine. And it's super important for other species like monarch butterfly, bumblebees, digger bees, and other pollinators. So having it be disturbed by pigs is not great. And then the Heinz emerald dragonfly is extremely rare and only lives in a few small populations in Illinois, Michigan, Missouri, and Wisconsin. And they are under attack by feral swine by damaging the wetland habitat that it depends on through the rooting and wallowing. So these are all, endangered species that we would love to keep around, but are under attack by feral swine just due to their nature. Another thing that feral swine bring are disease threats. So they can carry upwards of 30 diseases and 37 different parasites, including pseudorabies, swine flu, classical swine fever, swine brucellosis, E. coli, leptospirosis, and a whole list of other ones that just goes on and on. And these can be transferable to humans, pets, livestock, and wildlife. And the pig that we removed up in Linden did test positive for pseudorabies, which is really easily transferable to domestic pigs. So obviously not something that we want anywhere around our domestic pig food supply. So feral swine detection is something that we focus on a lot. So our main source of detection is the public. We rely on reports from everyday people that, some of them see feral pigs out in the woods. We've had pictures on game cameras submitted, people that are out hunting or walking, or, people that have seen damage on their lawns that call in. We get reports from hunters, landowners, telling us about pigs. We also rely on state agencies. Obviously, we've partnered with Vermont Fish and Wildlife, the Vermont Agency of Agriculture, to help us out with our feral swine problem as well. We also have been using detection dogs. So this is a picture of some Vermont staff using the dogs last summer. The dogs are trained to smell for sign of pigs and are able to detect pigs where humans might not be able to, just based off of the smell. So we ran these guys through a couple of places that we thought we might have feral pigs last summer, including some swamps and some other areas. So that's one of the tools that we use. Obviously, we run our own surveillance so when we get a report, we will go and try to find where we think that it is. We'll put up game cameras with bait tubes that have corn in it, and then try to get pictures of the pig. That's where all of the pictures that I will show you of the Vermont pigs have come from. And then also aerial surveillance has been used. It was used in 2015 and 2017 in New Hampshire. It's a little bit less useful in Vermont just because we don't have quite the population that they do. One of the problems that we do run into with reports and even pictures that we get ourselves is they look a lot like this, which is a picture that we received from the Charleston area up in the Northeast Kingdom. This was someone's game camera that they had placed out on a field, and they got this picture and it made its way into our hands. And I mean, looking at it, I can see a pig there, but I could also see potentially a coyote or something else. So it's just, you know, sometimes it's really hard to be able to figure out what it is that we're seeing or what it is that people are seeing. Because, you know, sometimes you see something in the woods and it looks really weird and people go, oh, it's a pig, and someone else goes and sees it and it's something else. So it's often difficult to be able to tell if a report of a pig is actually a pig or something else. Another tool that we use, and not so much us here in Vermont, but other states, are called Judas hogs. So they're effective for the removal of isolated or remnant populations. So basically trying to, you know, find the really hard to find population that you can't find. It basically involves capturing one of the pigs and then you put a radio telemetry collar on it so that you can find it again, and then you release it and it goes back to its sounder and you can go find it and then, you know, trap or remove the entire population there. Usually it seems that juvenile sows are the best for this because they're most likely to go back to their family group as opposed to males, which will disperse a whole lot more. It does have its difficulties. It can be difficult in thick vegetation and cover. Telemetry is a finicky tool at the best, and at the worst can be absolutely infuriating. And I do speak from personal experience doing telemetry on other animals that it's just so very, very hard. Trained dogs can be used to assist. So you have your collared pig, and then you send the dogs that can smell its trail and that can get you close enough to be able to use the telemetry to find. It's super labor intensive, takes a lot of man hours, a lot of personnel, just a lot of resources. Telemetry equipment is not cheap, and it is super expensive. If we did have a population that got established in Vermont, there is potential for us to use it here. We haven't so far because we don't think that we have enough of a population for us to warrant its use. So that brings us to what we do when we find populations of feral swine and how do we control them. So obviously trapping is one of the most ubiquitous uses. We also use bait and shoot. That picture on the top right there is of the Thetford individual that we removed. So another Vermont pig there. You can see our bait tube and its nice camouflage. And then hunting is also used as a control and management method, but it's not great for eradicating populations because feral pigs just reproduce so quickly that it, you know, hunting doesn't put enough pressure on them to decrease the population. So I'm going to go into each of these methods a little bit more. We'll talk about trapping first. These are all just different types of traps that you can use, and there's just a whole big variety out there. It is hard to trap pigs because they are very, very smart and very wary. Wireless game cameras and wireless traps are now in use, which have been a huge game changer for trapping success rates, and just have increased the success a lot by being able to, you know, set the trap off when the pig is in there because you got a picture of it from your wireless game camera. It's still really difficult, and we haven't had a lot of success doing it in Vermont. And that could just be because individual boars are more wary than a whole big group. Problems, You get bycatch. It's a little bit hard to see there, but that is a trap that has some vultures around it, and there's an alligator in there with the pig. That was obviously taken down in Florida, so nowhere near Vermont, but you can imagine the populations or the problems. That right there is a picture of a bobcat in a trap with the pig going up to the trap, so the bobcat set off the trap before the pig could get in there and get caught. You also have problems with pigs are really smart and really strong and can just break open some traps and escape, or they can figure out how the trap works. So they figured out how to pull up that gate there and were able to escape. Also, who knew they could climb? So pigs have been known to just climb their way out of traps, even when they've been completely sound on all other fronts. So trapping is definitely a useful tool and definitely can be used with great success, but also comes with its problems, as does any type of control method. So the method that we've used to most success in Vermont is bait and shoot, where you bait the pig in over a period of time and then remove it with a firearm. Let's see. So these, excluding the top left picture, are all pigs from Vermont. So that bottom left one in the snow is the pig from Lyndonville. The bottom right one is the Thetford pig, and the top right is the pig from Randolph. So as you can see in those, all three of those have bait tubes in them. So current feral swine investigations in Vermont. So we're continuing to investigate reports as we get them. This picture here is from a group of domestic pigs that you all may have heard of that escaped in Topsom, Vermont last summer and were just ranging around on the road for a couple of months. So we're investigating reports currently from Charleston, Coventry, Lyndonville, Arlington, and then we also have a game camera grid in the Connecticut River Valley to try to, this is a camera grid that we're running on both sides of the Connecticut River, so in Vermont and New Hampshire, to try to determine if we can catch pigs coming into Vermont before they make it farther outside of that area, and so we can try and trap them or remove them before they become a big established problem. And then going back to this picture of the domestics, Vermont is considering new legislation to redefine all free-ranging swines to feral status after 96 hours of notification of an escape. So this would make it a lot easier to classify who's in charge of domestic pigs that have escaped and have been out for a significant period of time. The problem with this Topsom escape is that they were still classified as domestic, and therefore no one really had jurisdiction over any of them to go and get them. So it was a whole big problem, and because of that, the legislature is considering this new legislation, although with the current condition of the world, who knows when that will go into effect, if ever. So that's all that I've got on my end. And we are asking people to report feral swine damage and sightings. You can contact us either by phone or by sending me an email, and I can pass it on to the appropriate people. And yeah, we hope that there aren't any feral swine in Vermont, but we would like to hear about them if they are, and if they turn out to be domestics, they turn out to be domestics, but we'd rather hear about it than have a feral swine that is out and about and no one has told us about it. So I guess with that, Lisa, I will take questions if we have any.
All right, great. We do have a few that have come in. Beth wants to know, what do they eat in the winter?
So obviously they're omnivores. What we found with the feral pig in Lyndonville during the winter is they survive off of their fat stores a whole lot. So the one that we had there, we had a bait tube out that it would go and eat a little bit of corn every day and then go right back to its nest and would just kind of sit there. Obviously, I mean, they can still hunt during the winter. So if they came across, you know, rabbits or something like that, or any kind of carrion, so roadkill, dead deer that a coyote had got, something like that, they would eat. So basically anything they can find, people's compost pits, you know, stuff like that.
Okay. Len wanted to know if you can explain what a peccary is.
A peccary, I believe, and I'm not an expert, is I think they're in South or Central America, and they're related to pigs, but are not actually pigs. They're a smaller version of it. I'm not 100% sure about all that because we don't have them in Vermont. So that's, I think, down in, you know, Texas and Arizona type of thing. But yeah.
Okay. And so I think down there they're in their native habitat, so it doesn't affect the habitat in the same way as the wild
Right.
ones up here would.
Right, exactly. Yeah, they would be native down there. So, I mean, you know, still potentially a nuisance problem, but not an invasive problem for wildlife or, you know, agricultural damage and stuff like that. So.
Okay. Okay. Len also wanted to know, how long does an escaped domestic pig have to run around in the woods before it should be considered a feral swine?
Well, so I talked about that legislation that they're trying to make it 96 hours. But going a little bit more into detail there, basically the amount of time that a pig needs to be out in the wild before it stops being domestic and becomes actually feral in nature depends on the pig. Adult pigs will take a lot longer because they still associate humans with food. So one of the ways that those pigs in Topsom were lured back in was with people going out there with a whole bunch of hamburger buns and hot dog buns and basically were like, here, food. And then the pigs followed them back to the enclosures. With piglets, it is a lot less time. So a piglet out in the woods after a month or two will become feral a lot quicker because it doesn't have that association with humans and food that adult pig will have. So it, you know, the timeline varies, but a piglet, a couple of months, an adult pig, 3, 4, 6 months, depending on its habits.
Emily asked, and then you answered it, how to contact Wildlife Services if they have something to report. And you put up your last slide, and your coworker Owen also answered in the chat box with some phone numbers. So anybody who wants to report any of these kinds of sightings should do so, and they can find Wildlife Services online as well by Googling it, but they put the numbers in the chat box as well. So you don't have to answer that one.
Well, and also if they can't find us for whatever reason and report it to Vermont Fish and Wildlife, we do get reports through them as well. So either to us or Vermont Fish and Wildlife are great ways to get in contact.
So Alice wants to know, when you say remove a pig, what does that involve?
I mean, it involves euthanizing it. We are not relocating pigs because they're invasive throughout the entirety of the United States, so we don't want them anywhere. So the way to do that is to kill
them. Betsy wants to know, do they taste good?
I personally have never had it. We have a policy against taking anything that we euthanize for our work purposes home with us. But I mean, obviously there are hunted species down south and in Hawaii. It depends state by state what the regulations are. In Vermont, we tell anyone who asks that they need to get permission from their local game warden before they try to harvest a pig, just because there's a chance that it could be an escaped domestic and you don't want to be shooting someone's farmyard pig. But what I've heard is they taste great, and they're obviously a species that people want to hunt, which is kind of why we have this problem to begin with, unfortunately.
Right, right. Yeah, they wreak havoc on the habitat for our native wildlife, which we really need to be concerned about. So that's interesting. I have a question. You used the word sounder a few times. You talked about them returning to their sounder. What is a sounder?
So a sounder is what we would, it's basically a herd of pigs. It's what, you know, all the animals have the different names that are associated with big groups of them. So a sounder of pigs can be anywhere from 5 to 6 individuals to there have been reports of up to 30 to 50 individuals down south, which is, a big group of pigs. And that's one of the reasons that hunting is not a great management tool, is because if, you're sitting there out in the woods wanting to shoot a pig and a big group of, even 5 or 6 or 10 to 12 come along and you only shoot 1 or 2 of them, the rest of those are just going to disperse out into the wild, and it can actually increase dispersal amongst the pigs, which is not something that we want. So that's, I think, about 10 years ago, New York banned hunting of wild pigs because they didn't want any to disperse, and they've actually been able to successfully remove all confirmed populations from New York.
Great. What is 3 takeaways? If people left this call and you really wanted them to take, 3 takeaways, what would they be?
I guess it would be, first of all, we don't want feral pigs in Vermont. There might be some hunters out there that are excited by the prospect of another species to hunt, but they are just absolutely terrible for all of the game species in Vermont, from deer to bear to upland game birds. And we just really don't want them. The other thing would be that we do have pigs in Vermont. We do have confirmed pigs, and definitely the potential to have more of them if we don't stay vigilant. And the third thing would be, if you do see a feral pig, even, if it's an escaped pig from your neighbor and it's an escaped pig from your neighbor, then you don't need to call us. But if you see something that looks like a pig and it's out on your lawn, we got a call a couple weeks ago from someone who said they had 4 pigs on their lawn. I called them back and they said that they had talked to the state police, and it turned out to be a couple houses down. But we still want those calls, because if it turns out to be a wild pig, we really want to hear about it before a population gets established, a group gets established, and before they, really embed themselves in the habitat, and it just gets so hard to find them and so hard to remove them. So I guess those would be my 3 takeaways, with the emphasis being on please report anything that you see. We want to hear about it.
That sounds great. Well, it looks like the chat box is pretty quiet. Oh, I got one more question from Toby that says, where are the closest established populations?
The closest established populations would be that population in New Hampshire, which is what that game camera grid down the Connecticut River Valley is trying to find. So we're trying to catch those before they come into Vermont, or even catch some of them in New Hampshire so that our New Hampshire office can go and remove them. And then the population that is up in Canada is not like a super established one, but there are a lot of sightings, and definitely out in the western part of Canada, they have a really established population of pigs that could, prove a threat to Vermont if they were to disperse southward.
Shannon was wondering, as we're talking about these established population, is the Corbin Hunting Preserve in New Hampshire a big contributing factor to those feral populations in New Hampshire crossing into Vermont?
I'm not familiar with what the actual preserve itself is called, but it was, we think, from an escaped couple of pigs from a hunting preserve, and then that established the population in New Hampshire, which is then what is potentially feeding into Vermont as they disperse from New Hampshire across the Connecticut River Valley.
Okay, and another question from Emily: can live feed cameras placed in strategic places help the detection, say in areas they might frequent, as in wet areas?
Yeah, that's definitely something that we consider. It is a little bit cost prohibitive just in getting that up and running, and then also having the personnel to be able to monitor that all the time. So what we do is we have the game cameras that are placed out on bait, and then if a pig or any other animal discovers a food source that is pretty consistent, they will come back to that. So we go and check those every 2 weeks or so to replace the bait and look through the images on that. And if we do have pictures of a pig on that, it's the 3 that we've removed in Vermont have been pretty consistent coming back to that bait, and we've been able to to get them on a bait tube. So I guess having live feed cameras could be useful in certain situations, but the scale that we're talking on is a little bit prohibitive because we're trying to cover the entire state here.
Okay, great. Well, we're rounding on 8 o'clock. I want to thank Brendan for sharing with us about feral pigs in Vermont and strategies we can all take to help prevent a population from establishing itself here in Vermont and affecting our wildlife and our habitat. My name is Lisa Sawsville of Vermont Coverts, and again, if you want to learn more about our programming, you can join our e-news. You can go to our website, www.vtcoverts.org, and sign up for our e-news. There's also a little donate button. If you're enjoying these programs, we could use your support. We wish everyone the best. Have a great evening, and thank you for joining us tonight.